Okay, guys, so welcome to the presentation for Unit 1 of Microeconomics, Econ 120. So, um, first thing we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at what the unit specific objectives are. So, we're trying to get some insight into the field of economics and how economists try to go about making sense of the world around us. The specific objectives would be that we want to explain why the study of economics is important to economists, of course, and to you and the program that you're doing. The next thing we're going to be looking at is trying to explain economics as a social science, distinguish between the subdisciplines of micro and macroeconomics, because most of you know you have a follow-up to do after micro, it is macro. Explain the importance of micro as a basis for macroeconomics, explain the process of economic theorizing, which is called hypothesis testing, um, and differentiate between positive and normative economics. So let's get going. So first off, start by defining what is economics. First off, economics is a social science that studies how people allocate their limited resources to try and satisfy as many of their unlimited wants. Now, we're going to get into more details about that in future um, units that will clarify this and bring more detail to it. But for now, what we're looking at is the fact that economics is a social science and that it tries to study the behavior of people using the scarce resources we have. So think about your income. We never have enough money. So how do we go about making those choices? In economics, we attempt to study how we make choices, and that is the whole thing. We want to understand why we do what we do, and we want to be able to predict some of that behavior. All right, so those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at, and that's what economics and economists try to understand as well. Um, so moving to defining economics. So economics is the study of how individuals and societies choose to use scarce resources that nature and previous generations provide. The key word is how we make our choices of what we're going to be using that for. And that's important for us to look at because, again, choices have consequences and we don't want to look at it from that perspective. Economics is a behavioral or social science, and what we're trying to do is study people and how they make choices. And therefore, when you're studying people, we are in fact investigating the society around us. That's why it's referred to as when we add all the choices we make as individuals, we are actually translating it into what society wants. And therefore, well, the word that economists will look at it is what the market wants. But the market is representative of the society that we live in. All right, so when we say economics is a social science, what do we mean? Well, a social science is a method of trying to study social behaviors using a scientific method. So it's a science because it proceeds using scientific methodology, and it's social because it's studying society. Simple. And the process that is utilized, the scientific process, is called hypothesis testing. And we use hypothesis testing to develop theories to explain and predict human behavior. So a theory that might come up, for example, would be as prices rise, quantities demanded fall. So that's a theory, but we can test it. And the process of testing it is by, first off, looking at the theory and then using that theory to form a question or hypothesis that we're going to ask to see if it's true. And in order to test it, we will design a study to test that question. So let's go back to the question I asked before. When prices rise, does the quantities demanded fall? So we have to work out a scenario to observe that and study what happens when prices go up. Now, ever so often, we have a budget coming up just now. Prices may go up through the impact of taxation or something along those lines. And what we can do is, as researchers, is design a study and conduct research to be able to capture the information that will measure the impact of that increase in price. And once we gather that data, we will extract from it the information and create observations. And those observations will either agree with the theory or the hypothesis that we've set up or disagree with the hypothesis. If it disagrees with the hypothesis, then we reject that hypothesis and go back to the theory that it came from and try to revise it. If, however, it supports the hypothesis, then that hypothesis becomes theory that's accepted into the field of economics and is accepted as a law or a rule that will hold to predict human behavior. So that is the process that is utilized. Now, when you all do statistical research methods, that is fundamentals of statistics, some of you may have attempted it already, or you're working on your mathematics fit, you'll start to see some of the techniques that are used, sampling, hypothesis testing, those things will come up in that course. And you'll see the linkage between this course and that um, in a real sense, because this is what supports most of the social sciences, the process of trying to extract scientific evidence out of society. And that's very difficult to do because you, we can't create an environment where we could go and test something by creating experiment. We can observe things because if we were to purposely go and increase prices somewhere, that would be rather unethical to do and put people in jeopardy. And yeah, it's not fair. So because it's not ethical for us to do that, we have to look for observational pieces of activities to try and gather data to see whether or not a hypothesis holds to be true. So most of the times we're looking backwards. We see something happen, we gather the data, and then we go backwards and say, okay, what caused this reaction by consumers? And that's the kind of thing that helps to develop testing and theories. All right, so let's leave that for now because we don't need to be staying here too long. So why is economics important? Now, there are five things that we've identified in our reasoning here. The first thing is to learn a new way of thinking or learning a way of thinking. And the way of thinking we're talking about here is rational, logical thinking processes. This is something that goes together with critical thinking. We want you to develop critical thinking skills. That's something that's written all over our course outlines. And economics helps us to look at things from a rational and logical perspective. And that's one of the reasons why you should study economics. Second, to understand society, which in other words means if we are trying to understand society, we are really trying to understand ourselves. And that is, in its sense, we're trying to explain why things happen the way they do in our society and maybe not in another society. So we're really trying to understand ourselves and our well, in global affairs, we're trying to understand the behavior of people in other countries and how they behave as opposed to we behave. So, for example, we don't have Thanksgiving here, but there's Thanksgiving in the States. So you see a lot of activities going on for Thanksgiving. October is coming up, we have Halloween. And our society does not respond to Halloween as a consumer event as it would happen in North America. And if you even look at the UK doesn't have Halloween, they have something called Guy Fawkes Day, which is something entirely different. But again, understanding global affairs also means how countries behave and how countries behave with each other. Why does the States want to have so much control over what's taking place in the Middle East? Because that has to do with global affairs. So economics is also going to help us to understand what's happening from a global perspective. Generally, we want you to be an informed citizen. Economics helps us to become informed decisions. So the next time when you listen to a budget speech, maybe you would have more insight and information about understanding what is happening in that budget speech and more from a logical and rational perspective rather than the type of rumshop talk that happens when we talk about how things impact upon what government policies are. So those are four of the reasons why. And then the last one is fairly basic. It's a foundation for further study. And in your program, for all of you who are doing one of our management programs, you are going to require the information from this to help support your understanding and development in the rest of the program. So it's a foundation for further study across the board. All right. So those are the 5 reasons that we've come up with why it's important to study economics. All right. So now we go to the distinction of micro and macro. Um, these are the 2 main branches of economics. There are other branches, but these are the 2 that you're going to be focusing on. Microeconomics tries to examine individual elements of our economy, and we're looking at the individual decision-making units, and that has to do with studying the behavior of firms and the behavior of households. Those are the basic units that make up our society and our economy. So we need to be looking at that. That's microeconomics. We're going to be studying their behavior a lot, both of these elements. If you look at the course outline, you'll see the theory, the separation of units actually supports this. Now, macroeconomics, on the other hand, is the branch of economics that examines economic behavior in an aggregate or total, what's the word I want to use? More of a global picture. Is going to look at the entire country altogether and try to evaluate what's happening on a national scale. So it's going to look at national income, it's going to look at unemployment, it's going to look at GNP, it's going to look at inflation and other is referred to as economic performance indicators to try and gauge what's happening in the economy. And those figures are large figures because they are adding together all of the activities of everybody. For example, how many cars we bought last year, how much chicken we bought last year, how much imported goods we bought last for the year, that kind of stuff. That kind of aggregated information shows patterns of behavior and begin to indicate what issues may be facing us. So macroeconomics is a very broad view of the economy, while microeconomics is very focused on the smallest elements of our society. So a simple analogy would be that microeconomics looks at individual units, the household, the firm, the industry. It sees and examines the trees. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, looks at the whole, all the aggregate information. It sees and analyzes the forest. That makes sense. So in microeconomics, we're just studying what happens with the trees, all the activities of the trees, whether or not the trees have leaves, the leaves fall off, do they bear fruit, how do they spread their seeds. Macroeconomics looks at the entire forest and decides, okay, this forest is doing something, it's forcing air up and is causing precipitation to take place and that type of stuff. So that's what the entire forest will do. But the forest is made up of trees, and therefore what happens is that in order for us to understand the forest, if we follow this analogy, we must understand trees and how they work before we can understand the entire forest. So that's the reason why we must look at, or we should be looking at, microeconomics before we begin looking at macro. Because it will make better sense for you to understand the inner workings of the economy before you begin to look at the whole economy operating together. So remember that it is important for you to remember the things we do in microeconomics because they become the basis for what happens in macroeconomics. That makes sense, guys? So if microeconomics allows us to understand the smallest elements of how the economy works before we engage in the analysis of the whole of the macroeconomy, that's the point we're trying to make here. All right, so now we come to positive and normative statements. A positive statement is a statement or observation of fact. It's dealing with what is, and facts can be tested and verified. So for example, this could be a fact. The ratio of staff to students in the college is 50-1. Now, how can we test that? Well, because we can get the information from registry about the amount of staff that is hired by the college and the number of students, and then we can work out and calculate the ratio. Now, I've just created this figure here, but it's a positive statement if in fact it were true. Possibly is actually. A normative statement, on the other hand, is an opinion or idea about what should be happening, or as the statement reads here, what ought to be. And the example I have is that a higher ratio of staff to students in the college would be better. Now, that's my opinion or somebody's opinion. Is it correct? Can it be tested? Can it be verified? No, but it's an opinion. Normative statements are opinions, positive statements are facts. And that leads us to two types of economic thinking processes. We have positive economics, which is an approach to economics that tries to utilize scientific methods to gather information to understand what's happening in our economy without judging what's happening. So because prices of a particular good goes up, but people still buy more of the good, we're not going to judge and say that's good or bad. What we're saying is that is what's happening. It just describes what exists and how it's working. We're not judging if it's right or wrong. Normative economics, on the other hand, is one that analyzes the outcomes of those positive observations and then evaluates them as whether or not it's good or bad, and therefore prescribe a course of action that is may mitigate against that behavior. So, for example, our country has a situation where although the exchange rate is rising, we're still purchasing a lot of goods online and we're still using a lot of foreign exchange to purchase those goods. Now, that the factor is that we can look at that and measure what's happening. That's the positive aspect of it. But the normative side of economics will evaluate whether or not that's a good thing for our country or not. And as a result, that can lead the government to prescribe a course of action that is called policy that will mitigate against that. So increasing taxation on that, or placing an outright ban on access to um, foreign exchange. Those are things that you want to look at in relation to that. So you see the connection between the two. And more importantly, you can see that we're going to focus a lot of our attention on positive economics and microeconomics. And normative economics is going to come up more in macroeconomics because we're going to be analyzing policy prescriptions from government, but we'll leave that for macroeconomics. But the combination of the two makes for useful evaluation of the economy and economic activity in a country. So that kind of brings us to the end of Unit 1. We have a summary here. What we looked at was defining economics as a social science. We explained what the social science was. We explained the process of how studying society follows scientific method by explaining a bit of hypothesis testing. We examined why we studied economics and we gave those 5 reasons. We differentiated between micro and macro economics, and we examined the link between them in terms of how they support each other, the micro supporting the macro and so on. We also looked at positive and normative statements and how they relate to positive and normative economics. And that then brings us to the end of Unit 1. So I hope that this was useful. Remember, you can contact me if you need clarification, and hopefully this helps you prepare for the quiz that's going to be put up for the material that's coming here. So thank you guys, and I hope that this was a useful presentation. Thank you very much.